Welcome. I'm Terry Soul, and this is Programming Chaos, a channel devoted to fun and interesting programming projects that can help you improve your programming skills. And today I want to talk about evolutionary particle life. So particle life is this very cool multi-agent force-based simulation that leads to all of the interesting behaviors we see here. The idea is that we have particles that are attracted and repulsed from each other based on forces, and that allows them to form these interesting, sort of very lifelike structures. And depending on the forces, you can get completely different structures that come out of it that, as you can see, give a semblance of life. So this looks a lot like an organism. Some of them move around. If they run into each other, as we'll see, they can interact in complicated ways, sort of get swept together. So that is the idea behind particle life, and I'll talk a little bit more about how it works in a moment. The problem, from my perspective, with particle life is that it isn't really an artificial life model. The particles are all, in a sense, independent. They're attracted and repulsed based on forces that they all share, but they don't, for example, reproduce, they don't evolve. It's a little bit like looking at a solar system, which is definitely a complex structure guided by physical forces, but it's not something that's alive. And so what I want to do in today's video is take a different version of particle life that actually adds that evolutionary component. So in order to do that, the first thing we need to do is understand a little bit about how the traditional particle life works. I'm going to do a quick summary. If you want to see it in more detail and code it yourself, I have a video on that linked here. And so let's take a look at how particle life is coded normally. So the basic idea, as I said, is that we have these particles and there's forces between them. And for any pair of particles, there's two forces that are important. One is sort of a repulsive force. I've represented the repulsive force in red here. And if this red particle gets close to this blue particle, so over here, it will start to get repulsed by this repulsive force. So that keeps any two particles from getting too close together. There's also a second force, I sometimes call it the primary force, that can be either attractive or repulsive. In this case, I've made it attractive, so you'll notice it's sort of a positive force. And so the red particle in this region is attracted to the blue particle. And so it'll be attracted for a while. Eventually, these two forces will balance out, and if it gets any closer, it'll start to get repulsed. So there's sort of a stable equilibrium where the red wants to be relative to the blue. What makes particle life interesting is those forces are not symmetric. The blue particle may respond very differently to the red particle. So in particular, the red particle might be attracted to the blue, but the blue might always be repulsed. And so you get this sort of following motion of the red particle chasing the blue particle. And that's what led to all of the interesting behaviors we saw a minute ago. And so just to be clear, this positive force could also be a negative one. And again, not symmetric for different colors. And so different colors of particles interact in different ways. For normal particle life, we simply apply these rules to all of the particles and we get very interesting emergent behaviors, but the particles are sort of all behaving independently. What I want is something that's a little more lifelike. And in particular, if we think back to how the particle life simulation looked, we got these very sort of organism or cellular looking structures moving around. And what kind of makes sense, at least to me, is to say, well, all of those particles are part of an organism and they share the same rules that hold them together. If you want to think of that as an organism, you can. I've sort of been going back and forth between two models. One is a set of cells that combine to form an organism. Another way to think of it is each of the particles is like an organelle, and the organelles come together to form a cell. Neither model is perfect. Both are sort of useful to think about. So we've got a subset of particles, let's say 50 particles, that have their own internal rules that make them to some extent a separate organism, a separate cell, or maybe a separate colony of individual cells, but they're all held together by the same rules. We would then also need rules for how they interact with other sets of particles. So here's the idea. I have a set of particles, and there are internal parameters that guide how those particles interact with each other. So in particular, there are the forces for how the red particles in the cell interact. I guess they're actually pink here, but good enough. How the green particles interact, how the green particles interact with the blue particles, how the green particles interact with the red, how the red interacts with the green, and so forth. So standard particle life rules, but only applied internally to this set of, say, 50 particles. And then we also need that minimum distance for the repulsive force, and we need the radius for that primary force. And in terms of the code I'm going to show, the internal forces all begin positive. They can change over time and become negative, but initially the internal forces are all positive to sort of hold things together. The other thing that turns out to be very important is the way a set of particles moves and interacts is not based just on the forces, it's also based on the arrangement of the particles. So if we want any sort of consistency, if we want to think of this like an organism or like a colony of independent cells that work together, for them to behave sort of the same way over and over again, they need to be structured the same. So we also need the relative initial position of each particle. So if I want to create a new cell or a new colony or a new organism, I pick the location of the center of that, and then I have the relative position of each particle when it starts. Immediately after starting, the forces take effect and the particles start moving around, but at least initially they're starting in a particular location. And that's pretty important. If they start in a random location, they may arrange themselves differently each time and behave very differently each time. So that's sort of what holds a cell or a colony of cells or an organism together, are these internal parameters. But if we want our cells to interact, so if I want to have here another set of particles, we need forces for how they interact with each other. And those are the external parameters over here. And so this set of cells, which I'm thinking of sort of like an organism, has parameters for how it holds together, but also parameters for how it interacts with any other particle. And these, at least initially, I'm allowing to be both positive and negative. So one set of particles could be attracted to another one, it could be repulsed by another one, or much more likely and oddly, the blue particles might be attracted to that organism or that other set, but the pink particles could be repulsed. And so then you get these weird behaviors between two different sets of particles, two different cells. So again, general idea, a set of particles, which we can think of a little bit like an organism or a cell or a colony, has internal parameters that kind of hold it together and external parameters for how it interacts with the real world. Now what I'm going to do is make this into an evolutionary model. And so for an evolutionary model, we need ideas of things like survival of the fittest and dying off and reproduction. And so the way that I'm going to do that in my code is I'm going to add to the environment a whole bunch of little particles that are going to turn out to be red that represent food. And anytime a gold particle gets close to a red particle, it eats it. And that gives a little energy to this whole cell. So this whole cell or this whole organism shares a set of energy. If it eats enough red particles, it gets enough energy to reproduce. And for a cell like this or a set of particles to reproduce, we just create another cell at a random location on the screen. So one of the things I'll mention, it would be really cool if a set of particles, you could actually watch it divide and run off. That causes all sorts of problems because initially it's going to be interacting with each other, and all of those interactions are going to really mess up the structure of the cell. So cheating a little bit, we have a set of particles. If it collects enough food, it reproduces another set at some random location on the screen. And not perfect, but it avoids that. They initially start overlapping, which causes all sorts of issues. In addition, that second set of particles inherits from its parent the same parameters. So if this set of particles has all of these parameters, when this set of particles reproduces and divides, the new set has all of these parameters with a little bit of variation, a little bit of mutation. So in this set, maybe red was attracted to a red with a force of 0.3. In the new offspring, I'd add a little random value there. So this number could get a little bigger or a little smaller. So this gives us some of the key features of evolution. Individuals survive if they collect enough food. And furthermore, if they collect a whole bunch of food, they get to reproduce. And sort of obvious, but I should have mentioned it, if they fail to collect enough food, they run out of energy and die. So survival of the fittest. If you move around and collect food, you get to reproduce. If you fail to collect food, you just die. Now, normally, this is the point at which I would start writing the code so you could follow along and code it all for yourself. I'm not going to do that. And the main reason is it would take much too long. That's probably 2 hours to go through all the code. So I'm going to show it, but I'm not actually going to type it out the way I normally do. And instead, I'll post a link to the code in the comments below, with the caveat that I've thrown this together in the last week or so. It's not the most beautiful code in the world. Probably lots of places to improve it. Feel free. Okay, so let's take a little bit of a look at the code and sort of the results we get. Okay, so here's the code. Again, I'm going to walk through it very quickly, but it's posted below. 3 major parts. There is a particle class, which again, instead, if you wanted, you could think of each particle as a cell that's part of a colony of cells, or you could think of it as, for example, an organelle within a cell. And particles have position and velocity, and we have to apply a bunch of different forces to them. So there's the internal forces that we apply to each particle to sort of hold together a collection of particles as an organism. We apply external forces and a separate set of rules for the food forces. So food is a particle, but it's got its own set of rules that get applied. So we have individual particles, and then we have what I'm calling a cell, or you could think of this as a colony of cells if you want to think of each particle as a cell. And a cell is that collection of, say, 50 particles that represents, in some sense, an organism. So it has to know its internal forces, its external forces, the internal radius of the repulsive force, the external radius of the repulsive force. So that is, what is the repulsive force for particles that are other versus particles that are self? The internal and external radiuses of that primary force, which can be attractive or repulsive. And again, if this is a little confusing, watch the previous video on particle life and it'll make a lot more sense. There's an array of the initial positions so that when we create a new set of particles, they can all start in the right initial positions. So a lot of data associated with each cell. A lot of comments that I've thrown in that you can go through, and including some information on maybe improving the code. Here we turn those forces into actual tables, and then here's the function to generate new values randomly. We can copy a cell. So when an organism gets to reproduce, we copy all of its values over into the new one, and then after we've copied them, we mutate them, which takes each of those forces and radii and adds a small bit of random noise to it. So those are sort of the basic steps in terms of how the cells work. And the key thing here again is a cell consists of a set, in this case, of 40 particles, and a cell has energy associated with it. Worth noting, when it reproduces, it loses some of its energy. It gives it to its offspring. If we go to our main tab, you can see here We have how much energy a cell gets when it picks up a piece of food, which we could change, the minimum population, so the minimum number of cells on the screen at the time. So there's a bunch of parameters and then sort of our setup. So let's go ahead and run this and take a look at how an evolutionary particle system looks. So here we go. You can see this is a little clump of 40 cells. Here's another clump. Here's probably 2 clumps that have been attracted to each other. And so in general, because the internal forces are initially positive, the cells clump together, although you can see they occasionally lose cells or lose particles, and they interact in complicated ways. This is all sort of random behaviors right at the moment. The red particles, as I mentioned, are food, and so you can watch here if a yellow particle gets close enough, it eats the red food and picks up a little bit of energy. So there, that red particle just disappeared and that clump gained some energy. You'll notice occasionally particles disappear. This one is not moving, so it's going to have a hard time picking up food, so it's probably going to disappear here in a moment, maybe. Or maybe it's going to get pushed into some food. And if a clump picks up enough food, then, as I said, it gets to reproduce. And so we started with 15 organisms or 15 cells. It looks like we already have more than that. So they've done a pretty good job of collecting food up here. So maybe some of them have gotten to reproduce. One of the things you'll notice is some random particles sort of scattered around. Initially, those internal forces are positive to hold cells together, but they are allowed to mutate. So they could become negative. So we could have cells that like force their own particles away. And in this model, that's fine. But you could create another model where if a particle gets too far away, it dies or disappears or something. Another thing that can happen because we have these external forces is external forces could sort of pull a cell apart. One of the things I put in the code that's helpful to sort of think about that is lines between shared particles. So you'll notice this is a clump of particles that are all part of the same cell or the same organism. It's a little hard to see the lines, but they're all connected. This organism, which may actually be 2 or 3, has lost some of its particles. They're over here, and you can see connected by lines. The lines doesn't work particularly well when things wrap. So this is one cell or one organism. It just happens to wrap, so it draws the lines the long way. This looks like it's 2 that are following each other. So you can get out of this all sorts of complicated behaviors. So very basic behaviors are things like try and move fairly quickly, like this organism or colony is doing, to sweep up as much food as possible. It's a very basic behavior, and if you're successful at that, you'll get to reproduce. But you can get more complicated behaviors like follow other organisms around in maybe a parasitic way and use their motion to try and sweep up food. Or maybe this is some sort of a symbiosis going on where the 2 sets of particles work together to move more quickly to collect food. So those are some interesting behaviors that at least in theory can evolve. One of the downsides is to really see evolution, we have to run this for a long time. As I said, the initial population is 15 individuals, which is minuscule, right? If you think about real biological populations, a population with 15 individuals is on the ragged edge of extinction. I've got a slow computer, that's sort of what I have to deal with here. One of the things that's in the code to sort of help that a little bit is that initial 15, if an individual dies, so there's a population of only 14, one of the remaining 14 automatically gets picked at random to reproduce regardless of its energy level. So there's kind of 2 phases of evolution. At the very beginning, there's an evolutionary phase in which all you have to do is survive. Just get enough food to not die, because if you get enough food to not die, some other organism or cell will not get enough food and will die, and then you have a random chance of reproducing. And this is a good way, if you're interested in evolutionary models, especially these sort of artificial life ones, to start your simulation. A minimum population size, and if individuals die and drop below that minimum, pick one at random to reproduce. If you don't do that because the initial individuals are totally random and in fact are probably very ill suited to their environment, you might get an extinction event, which is not much fun. Once the cells start getting better at moving and collecting food, then the second sort of phase of evolution comes in, where you want to collect food faster than anybody else so you can reproduce faster. And we're already starting to see a little bit of that. So you'll notice a lot of these cells have the same sort of structure: pink in front, yellow and green mixed in the middle. So here's another one: pink in front, some yellow and green, not exactly the same, light blue around the edges. So these organisms are probably, in a sense, all related. They maybe had a common ancestor, and it's not a terrible strategy. They are moving not super quickly, but kind of quickly, as opposed at least to where we started. So we do get a little bit of motion moving along to collect food. They're also more cohesive, so they stick together a little better. There's less of that, I'm going to run up, sort of mix with other organisms. And we can watch. I'm not sure what's going to happen if a couple of them run into each other. Let's see if we get lucky here. And of course, they're staying way far apart. And that might be the forces. The external forces might have evolved to have a very long radius. There, you saw that one, or maybe not. It slowed down when it got close. So it does seem like they're starting to repulse each other. They want to stay uniform cells, and they're trying to avoid the other cells. So already we're seeing some evolution. If we want to see a lot of evolution, we've got to wait, like I said, maybe a couple of hours. Even better would be to have a much bigger population size. So what I'm going to do now is jump ahead and show the results that we get after a few hours of evolution. So here's a nice example where we can see the particles are moving much faster, and they're doing a good job generally of sticking together. And when they start to approach each other, you can see they sort of move away. So they're trying to maintain cohesion and move pretty quickly to collect food. And it's a very typical evolutionary outcome. Here, on the other hand, is something very unexpected. So you'll notice that in this model, there seem to be particles scattered all over. And when a new cell appears, it doesn't form a cohesive group. It instead kind of explodes. And if we watch carefully, you can see the yellow particles, which are the particles that eat food, are very uniformly scattered. And if a new food particle appears, the yellow particles near it are immediately attracted towards it. So what has evolved here is a completely different strategy, but interestingly enough, one that has analogs in the real world. What we're kind of seeing here is ambush predators. So each yellow particle acting independently is kind of like an ambush predator. It just sits there and waits for a red particle to get near it, and then it moves over and grabs it. And there's another even more interesting analog here. So if you want, you can think of these a little bit like, say, trapdoor spiders. Each yellow particle is a trapdoor spider that's waiting for food to appear near it, and then it goes and grabs it. Another thing that spiders do, I'll use that as my example, is this thing called ballooning. Baby spiders will climb up, maybe to the top of a post or the top of a branch, and then they'll release a thread of webbing that catches in the wind, and it carries them up, and it can carry them way far away, and then they'll land and start a new web there. So that's one strategy that spiders use in order to sort of scatter their young and cover a big area. It also keeps them from all being clumped together. Spiders tend to have hundreds, if not thousands, of babies. There's not going to be enough food if they stay close together, so ballooning allows them to spread out. Well, you'll notice in this model, when a cell appears, all of those yellow particles immediately sort of explode outward. What's evolved is a negative force between the yellow particles that pushes them apart. So not only are these acting a little bit like ambush predators, they've also sort of evolved kind of like a ballooning behavior to make sure that they are spread out. And probably related to that, you'll notice the non-yellow particles are forming these clumps that move around and shove the yellow particles around. So really, in a sense, this species has evolved to do a really good job of covering the area so that it can collect as much food as possible. And in the process has created some analogs to real biological organisms, which, let's face it, is pretty cool. The ambush predator is something you often see in A-life models. So I have a video on evolving zombies in NetLogo. I'll put a link here, and you get the same sort of evolutionary behavior. The zombies evolve to stand still, and then when a human appears, they dash out to grab it. Okay, so now that we've taken a look at the model, I want to talk about some things that can be done with it. And probably a lot of these have already occurred to you, but I'll mention a few of them, so give you something to play with. I haven't gotten a chance to yet. One thing that we can start with is each cell or each organism consists of several different types of particles. There's actually 6 types total. Type 0 is food. Type 1, which are sort of the yellow gold ones, are what do the eating. The other types are just there to generate forces. But it would be really cool if they were given sort of biological roles. So maybe the blue particles store energy. The more blue particles you have, the more energy you can store. Maybe the green particles can attack other organisms. So if your green particle gets near another organism's blue particle, you get to steal some of this stored food. And that could lead to really interesting behaviors where when an organism approaches another one, suddenly all of the green particles move out to try and grab it, in a sense. And if we have green particles that are aggressors, then maybe we could make the pink particles defensive particles. And so if a green particle gets near a pink particle, that organism loses some energy. So it'd be very cool to give more of the particles different roles to create more complicated behaviors. I mentioned earlier this notion of sort of scattering your particles across the whole map feels a little weird. So we could put in some rules where if an organism's particles get too far away, they're deleted and you suffer some negative consequences. That would certainly encourage more cohesive forms. In the model that I'm working with right at the moment, the mutation step, if I come down to the mutation step, particles are allowed to change type. So over time, and I haven't studied this, but it seems likely that an organism or a cell will get more and more of the yellow particles because they're good for collecting food. What they can't do is change the number of particles. Every cell is fixed with 40. That would be a cool thing to add. Could you get sort of bigger agglomerations of particles or smaller ones? Other things, when a cell dies, all of the particles just vanish. Instead, they could remain around. They could become food particles. The problem with that is, unless you balance your model very carefully, you quickly run into an overabundance of food, and then the population gets huge, and at least for me, the whole simulation grinds to a halt because there's way too many cells and particles moving around. So I played with that a little bit, but had a real hard time getting it balanced well. But if you balanced it well, it would be cool because then we could have sort of scavengers. So there's just a few suggestions for different ways that we could take this evolutionary model and take it a lot further. If you get any interesting results, or if you sort of take the code that I have and take it further and try some of these things out, please feel free to put a link in the comments below. The one thing I might ask is, reference back to this video, because it'd be nice to get a little credit for at least proposing the idea, but definitely see what you can do with this, and I encourage you to run with it. Thank you.